This is Waldemar Januszczak, art critic, producer and presenter of documentaries, and this is Perspective, part of the Little Dot Studios network.
The Cité Radieuse, the Radiant City. A building that has become mythical, an emblem of modern architecture. The inhabitants of Marseille have nicknamed it Le Meuble de Fada, the Nutter's House. It is the work of one of the most famous architects of the 20th century, Le Corbusier. A star of contemporary art, Xavier Veillon describes this post-war construction as a masterpiece and talks about it with a passion rarely bestowed on social housing.
It's very imposing when you see it in real life, like a huge ocean liner. It's pretty spectacular. The building has an identity, so that when you live in the Cité Radieuse, you live in something unique. So that's one thing about it that's epic. And when you go inside, it really makes an impact. When you're on top of it, you really feel you're on the beach or on the deck of a ship.
On the roof of the Cité Radieuse, in this environment that the architect wanted to be symbiotic with nature, the mountains in the background, the sea and the sky, Xavier Veillon pays homage to the creator he admired with his installation.
The idea was not to start from a neutral point, like a museum hall or a gallery, but to work from somewhere that already had strong connotations, and to use this place as a starting point around which to construct an exhibition. And I like the idea of this sort of inversion, of the architect drawing on the ground of his own, already constructed, building.
C'est aussi un personnage qui est très ambigu. Je pense que c'est quelqu'un d'un côté un peu austère.
He is also a very ambiguous a person with a somewhat austere side. It's tricky to really understand who this character is, with his many dual aspects. For example, painter in the morning, architect in the afternoon. Both dogmatic and human. In doing what he did, he defined himself as Le Corbusier. He invented his own role, which was to be Le Corbusier, you might say.
Le Corbusier is so representative of architecture that he can be thought of as synonymous with it. With his large round glasses, his austere clothing and his bow tie, his geometric appearance was a skillfully fashioned trademark. His world-famous achievements are true icons. Like the Villa Savoy, the Cité Radieuse, or the Ronchamp Chapel.
Le Corbusier has left to the world are some of the most extraordinary buildings ever constructed in all of time.
Both a builder and an unparalleled theorist, his numerous works have had a lasting influence on generations of architects. Le Corbusier was also a great idealist who wanted to change the world with his architectural works.
In all these terms, Cité Radieuse, Ville Radieuse, there is this continual idea of making people happy, of creating the ideal city, the ideal place.
Le Corbusier is a tale of incredible ambition, that of a very rational spirit and a great, uncompromising artist, ready to demolish entire neighborhoods of Paris for the good of its inhabitants. He was also a great seducer who made his mark. Hungry for recognition, he maintained an extensive correspondence with his mother, in which he tried endlessly to convince her that he was a very great artist.
Marie Generale Paré was the love of Le Corbusier's life.
He never gives up with trying to get his mother's approval. He never can really get things right for her.
Le Corbusier, or the story of a life dedicated to modern architecture. It was in 1887 in La Chaux-de-Fonds, a town enclosed in a Swiss valley, that Charles-Édouard Generale was born. He was later to become the great Le Corbusier. He was the youngest child of a close-knit petit bourgeois Protestant family. The Generales had lived in this watchmaking capital for 4 centuries. As such, from father to son, they were watch engravers. They were a family with conservative values, where it was obligatory to fit the mold.
The values of this family are very clear. Papa always said, what you need to do it now. This was also said to be the motto of the mother's family. Hard work, no point in complaining, although the mother will discover complains as much as she wants, but what she complains about usually is her younger son, Charles-Édouard.
Charles-Édouard was a rather inattentive student. His school results were mediocre and disappointed his parents. He was a child that didn't particularly flourish, overshadowed by the perfect image of his brother Albert, a year and a half his elder, and his mother's blue-eyed boy.
Charles-Édouard has that sense throughout his childhood that their mother was always more aware of Albert.
Albert was a gifted violinist whom his mother, Marie, was proud of. As a piano teacher, she dreamed of a great career as a composer for her eldest son, who, advanced beyond his years, was already giving concerts at the age of 11. In an attempt to distinguish himself in his mother's eyes, the young Charles-Édouard would have to carve out his own path. But in the meantime, his parents set him on a well-defined path. At the age of 13, he was sent to the town's School of Applied Art in 1900. Following in the family tradition, he was to become a watch engraver. Charles-Édouard proved to be somewhat gifted at this exercise in precision. This is one of his watches. But he detested this repetitive craft that required so little creativity. At school, the young man would finally discover a subject that he found much more exciting than watchmaking: drawing. He assiduously followed the classes of Charles Le Platanier, who taught his students to observe nature, to draw inspiration from it, to create new shapes. The young Generale launched himself passionately into this exercise. He drew the surrounding pine forests, scrutinizing the smallest details of his environment, like the structure of the branches of the trees or the pine cones. Le Corbusier would later write that Le Platanier opened up a new route for him into creativity.
I don't know what it was, but he inspired something sacred, something great in me, something abstract and elusive, a thirst for art.
The teacher was impressed by his young students' watercolors. The pine trees were reduced to the very essence of their form. In a very conceptual way, he transformed the forest into geometric patterns. Le Platanier detected in him a rational mind paired with an obvious talent, 2 of the virtues required to become an architect. Following his teacher's invaluable advice, Charles-Édouard Generale, at the age of 17, enrolled to study architecture. The young student, who at school had never been excited by theoretical classes, would achieve a real tour de force. He persuaded one of his teachers, Louis Fallet, to entrust the construction of his own house to him. After a year of design and 2 years in construction, the house was completed in 1907. Charles-Édouard was not yet 20 years old. This is the result. In principle, it looked like an ordinary chalet. It was still far from being a Le Corbusier house, but a closer look reveals certain details which herald his future style. In particular, the simplicity of the ornamentation, like these very geometric pine trees. The apprentice architect had fully taken on board the lesson about naturalism. But above all, this first project would set Charles-Édouard free. He had found his calling and a real confidence in his own talent.
At the age of 17, I was fortunate to meet a man free of prejudice, who entrusted the construction of his house to me. I realized then a house was built using materials and workers, and that it was the plans for it which determine whether it is a failure or a success. I had a real fear of school education, and I was convinced of the need to call on my personal judgment.
On the strength of this first experience, Charletois considered that he was wasting his time on too academic an education. He left school without telling his parents, convinced that he would learn better by himself.
He never goes far enough with architectural training to receive a diploma. He was never a certified architect in his entire life.
Charles-Édouard Jeanneret est un rebelle.
Charles-Édouard Jeanneret was a rebel. He broke the mould. In 1907, he would read Nietzsche's novel Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which his teacher, Le Platinaire, had given him. In Zarathustra, he greatly identified with the figure of the creator, who breaks the tablets of law. He would then try to do just that, to break from Le Platinaire's training, and would end up detesting him and calling him a liar.
When he was 19 years old, he boarded a train to go to Italy. His parents were furious, very disappointed in him. He's supposed to keep up his studies.
Indifferent to his parents' recriminations, the young man decided that from then on he would educate himself through travel. He wanted to discover the greatest achievements in the history of architecture in his search for perfection. Charletois naturally started his quest in Italy with its built heritage of inestimable value, its Roman ruins, its marvelous Renaissance constructions. He tirelessly drew all these buildings, taking measurements, scrutinizing them, and examining them in every detail, in particular the Duomo in Florence, which he exalted.
It's almost impossible to convey the intensity with which young Charles-Édouard Jeanneret responded to certain buildings. It was like a religious experience to him.
Charles-Édouard Jeanneret did not limit himself to Italy. He also marveled at the eastern palaces of Istanbul. With an endless thirst for knowledge, he would discover other forms of habitation, particularly in Central Europe. But it was in Greece that he would have the most intensely aesthetic experience, finding what came closest to perfection in Athens, the Acropolis.
For 2 weeks, he goes back and forth to the Acropolis. At times, it's like the most passionate love affair. At times, it's like a battle between him and the building. And at other moments, he feels crushed by it. He takes in the building from near. He takes it in from far. He studies it, but everything penetrates him.
Cette posture d'observateur.
This position of observer, this practice of notation through writing and sketching, led him to break away from his training and to construct his own world. And this world, made of sketches, watercolours and photos, would form a sort of well that he would draw from for the rest of his life.
Dans lequel il va puiser jusqu'à la fin de ses jours.
During his numerous travels across Europe, he put the finishing touches to his training, working with renowned architects. In 1909, while working with the Perret brothers in Paris, he discovered a new material, reinforced concrete, which would later play an essential role. In the meantime, in 1912, he returned to his hometown in Switzerland, eager to set up on his own. At 25 and without a degree, Charletois opened his architect's practice in this house in the centre of town. On his business cards, he wrote Generale Architect, construction of villas and homes in the country. Among the buildings he worked on at that time, one project above all was important for him, the house commissioned by his parents. La Villa Blanche, the White Villa. Charletois wanted to impress his mother, so he built her a mini Parthenon. Like a Greek temple, the house sits majestically atop a pedestal overlooking the grounds. The visitor comes upon it by climbing up a winding path, inspired by the one he took up to the Parthenon. A declaration of love for his mother. He also totally turned on its head the traditional layout of an early 20th century home.
In the Villa Blanche, he made the center of the house the music room for his mother.
We could say that Marie-Charlotte Amélie Generale Perret was the love of Le Corbusier's life. He constantly looked to her with all his successes, but also at times when he experienced failure and disappointments. We can clearly see that in the Generale's family saga, his brother Albert was meant to be the hero in this family, which was more focused on music than on visual arts. And he himself was a mere architect. So he would spend his life for nearly 53 years writing to his mother to tell her that he was the good son.
To show his mother that from then on he deserved her full attention, that he was a great architect, he built her an inordinately grand house.
It's elegant, it has terraces, it has reception rooms for social events. It's got a kitchen big enough for people who entertain and have lots of people coming for dinner. They don't give dinner parties. Their idea of a meal was the 4 family members together. They are frugal people, they live modestly, and suddenly they're spending their life savings on a very grand house.
This house became a poison chalice. His parents had to go into debt to pay for such a grand project. Too much debt.
The house bankrupts them. By 1919, they had to sell the house, and they had to sell the house at a substantial loss. He has a tremendous sense of culpability. He knows that his mother and father have been hardworking people without a franc to spare, and yet he has caused them to lose most of their modest fortune.
Even before his parents experienced these difficulties, Charlotte found that his hometown was too small a stage for him to show his mother the extent of his talent, since commissions were rare, only 3 houses in 5 years. He got by doing small jobs and ended up loathing his hometown, which restricted his great ambition.
La Chaux de Fonds is a blot on the landscape. I hate this town. The people too. I can do nothing but be dragged down here. There is little work. They don't undertake major projects in this town. I have nothing and will have nothing to do this year. My ambition, my vanity and my pride are pushing me towards great works.
Having just turned 30, Charlotte decided that there was only one place for him to be recognized as a great artist: Paris, which was the cultural capital of Europe at that time.
For a young man from a provincial town like La Chaux de Fonds, seducing and conquering Paris was a massive undertaking. But that is what Generale was going to try to do.
Charlotte did not arrive in Paris at the best time. It was 1917, in the middle of the World War, and the capital was subjected to German bombings, particularly by the super-heavy mortar Big Bertha.
He was fascinated with the experience of going into the cave, seeking shelter, but then he would leave the shelters and feel a palpable excitement from explosions, from fire, from people running. It's as if he didn't quite fathom the risk or the pain of death. He's more excited by all the motion.
Charlotte watched history playing out before his eyes and wanted to be part of it, to leave his mark on the era. During the post-war period of Reconstruction, he opened his architect's practice, but it didn't take off. He was a nobody from the provinces, newly arrived from Switzerland. To get closer to the fashionable artistic circles, he spent time in the cabarets of Montmartre, started to paint, and like all Bohemian artists, finished his nights in Parisian brothels, drawing prostitutes. He was not convinced by his own work. That was not how he was going to make his mark.
My efforts are deformed, disappointing. My women have a bestial, crude, rutting wantonness.
Unemployed, impoverished, depressed, Charles-Edouard was to have an encounter that would change everything. Friendship at first sight with Amédée Ozenfant, a trend-setting society painter who opened doors for him. He would introduce him to modern painting. This is what Charles-Edouard Generale painted in 1919, adopting what was called a purist style. Painting was to play an important role in his life and strongly influence his architecture. But in the meantime, this new friend would above all enable Charles-Edouard to enter the very closed circle of the Parisian artistic avant-garde.
He discovered an environment beyond the business environment of Swiss immigrants in Paris, with whom he spent a lot of time, an environment that would stimulate him. Ozenfant would introduce him to patrons, collectors, intellectuals, other painters, and so take the role of a sort of agent or impresario in Charles-Edouard's conquest of Paris.
Together, they created an avant-garde magazine, L'Esprit Nouveau, which covered all forms of art. This magazine became a reference point within the art world and attracted great names such as Aragon, Picabia, and Fénelon Léger. The most notable articles were those dedicated to architecture. They were signed by an unknown Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier, a curious character. Round black shell glasses, severe suit and bow tie. A dress code that would never change. Le Corbusier was born. He was the character that Charles-Edouard created for himself in 1920. His double. From then on, he spoke of himself in the third person, as here in a letter to his mother.
Le Corbusier is a pseudonym. Le Corbusier does architecture alone. He is an entity released from the burden of flesh. Charles-Edouard Generale is a man of flesh and blood who has experienced all the radiant and desperate adventures of a rather turbulent life.
Le Corbusier was extremely aware of his appearance. When we look at this photograph of him, we're aware that he constructed himself just as he constructed buildings. He also was very deliberate in his choice of eyeglasses, and it's because of his preference for perfectly round ones that many architects since him have been wearing the same. I.M. Philip Johnson, and so on.
In 1922, Le Corbusier won the heart of a young woman, Yvonne Galice, a model who would give up her career to marry him. Yvonne, a housewife, would remain in the architect's shadow for the rest of her life. They had no children. Le Corbusier felt that there was no room for them with his career. At this time, Le Corbusier was no longer just writing for magazines, but wrote 34 architectural works. His self-taught path gave him total freedom vis-à-vis the dominant classical ways of thinking. In this way, he established himself as one of the great theoreticians of modern architecture.
Ce qui est impressionnant au début des années 20, quand
At the start of the 1920s, what was so impressive was the breadth of activities of a man who was just in his early 30s. He was at one and the same time an essayist, an editor, painter, architect, urbanist, lecturer. So he was someone who drew on an extraordinary range of talents, and he excelled in all these fields to become a central figure in Parisian life.
De la vie parisienne.
In the 1920s, Le Corbusier was encouraged by a radical change in society's way of thinking. He was fascinated by the modernity of liners, planes, cars. He believed in the superiority of new techniques, the progress being made thanks to machines. In his landmark work, Vers une architecture, he demonstrated that it was necessary to adapt housing to these profound changes. So he invented a revolutionary concept, the machine for living. This formula would influence several generations of architects.
Le Corbusier used a lot of iconography and photo montage to try and convince others that architecture needed to be developed away from the 19th century towards a modern architecture. And since he has a great sense of publicity before this time, he didn't hesitate to make montages that were almost surrealist, by superimposing a car over the Parthenon, for example. But it was motivated by a desire to educate, to say, what is it about Parthenon that seduces and moves us? He applied the notion of a standard to the Parthenon. He said that a standard is an object that has reached an extraordinary level of refinement, because it has been mass-produced and is recognized by everyone, and everyone can identify with the symbolism of this object.
For Le Corbusier, the best example of an object approaching perfection was the Ford T, mass-produced in millions in the United States. The same model for all, universal and democratic. This principle must now be applied to housing. Le Corbusier worked to develop standardized, functional and reproducible housing. Like this individual house or the immeuble villas, apartments stacked high with their private garden. The problem was that in France at the start of the 20th century, architecture was still very academic, lacking audacity. The Haussmannian style, inherited from the 18th century, largely dominated. But what most shocked the architect was how dirty the city was. Behind the beautiful facades of the bourgeois buildings on the grand boulevards, the narrow streets didn't let in any light. The buildings were unsanitary, the inhabitants sometimes living in deplorably unhygienic conditions.
There has been a total collapse. Cities have become inhumane, hostile towards men and dangerous for their physical and moral health. But here we have town planning.
Le Corbusier, then a young man in his 30s, proposed a very radical solution, an electroshock that would really get the ink flowing. He wanted to flatten a part of the centre of Paris to build the Plein Voisin there, 18 skyscrapers, each 200 metres tall. The equivalent of Tour Montparnasse. An immense grid of buildings that would house more than 3 million inhabitants. It would be interspersed with roads 100 to 120 metres wide for cars to flow through. The area that he wanted to clear contained the historic quarter of Le Marais. It stretched from the Place de la République to Rue de Rivoli and up to Saint-Lazare station. For Le Corbusier, the old town had its day, and it had to make way for something new.
In Le Corbusier's generation, every architect agreed on the fact that the towns of the past had to be radically transformed, destroyed even. They were unhealthy towns, labyrinthine cities. Modern cities had to be completely new.
Henceforth, the fundamental principle of this architectural and social revolution can be distilled into the three elements that since the beginning of time have conditioned the life of men: sun, space, trees. The major reform that will take place in the function of architecture is founded on these three factors.
This was the hygienist era, so the old town was considered to be polluted. The sun didn't penetrate, the children suffered from rickets. The vision of the old town was wholly negative. The straight line was the way man took, and the line in the old-fashioned quarters, the zigzag line, was the ass's way. So our heritage was destroyed, and just the churches left, because it was thought they couldn't be destroyed, and the idea put forward was for a new city made up of towers.
In constructing the tall towers, he had one key objective: to improve the quality of life of every inhabitant. With this vertical architecture, he could free up space on the ground, and in so doing, reverse the relationship between the buildings and green spaces.
Des terrains de sport, un stade, une piscine.
Sports fields, a stadium, a swimming pool, tennis courts, basketball courts. Then, paths for pedestrians. Pedestrians have fast tracks that pass under the houses, pathways for walking, then parks planted around the paths, around stadiums, around tennis courts and football pitches. And so the city is covered in greenery. It is a green city, constructed of 12% build-up space and 88% parkland.
De surface bâtie et à 88% de parc.
He didn't disregard nature, he worshipped nature. He gave people a modern building, but it's so that they can look at the sky, they can contemplate the universe, they can think about those values.
Le projet très pratique du plan voisin, c'était bien sûr de...
The practical aspect of the plan voisin was, of course, to free up space on the ground, to allow nature to penetrate the city. You can only increase the density in two ways, either by constructing horizontally, but very densely, or by building upwards, but with the compensation of being able to create parks and gardens on the ground.
Au fond, si on résume...
The idea of constructing towers in Paris and developing the natural elements is where we're at today. Today we're thinking that it would be interesting to construct towers in Paris and to create green spaces on rooftops and as much parkland as possible. So essentially, maybe there is a sort of return. Of course, we now no longer think of eradicating our heritage, starting with a clean slate, but nonetheless, some of these objectives could be acceptable today.
admissible aujourd'hui.
Of course, in 1925, the popular press was outraged, and it provoked a national debate. The Plan Voisin set in place a misunderstanding that was to continue for the long term. One part of the public saw Le Corbusier as someone who wanted to concrete over urban landscapes. Another saw him as inspirational in dealing with the challenges of housing. Whichever way, it was an incredible publicity coup. Le Corbusier's career was about to take off. He would achieve success, but not with towers. In the 1920s, Le Corbusier constructed a dozen individual villas for friends and rich clients. Like this one in Paris, in the 14th arrondissement, which he constructed for his friend, the painter Amédée Ensenfant, with a huge glass wall in his studio. That same year, in Boulogne-Billancourt, the Mechaninoff Villa for another painter. This time, the studio is on the ground floor. In 1925, he created the La Roche Villa for a rich banker who collected modern art, with an immense room to display his paintings. In 1927, he completed the imposing Stein de Monzy Villa. It's hard to imagine that all these houses were constructed almost 90 years ago. The best known among them has become an icon, the Savoy Villa. Today, this construction is considered to be one of the 5 major works in the history of 20th century architecture. Ever since it was constructed, it has dazzled through its purity and harmony. Its form was inspired by Le Corbusier's purist paintings.
Why is Villa Savoy beautiful? Because it uses simple shapes. Le Corbusier wrote, "The simple shapes are beautiful because we can read them easily. The cube, the sphere, the triangle, the pyramid. It has an obviousness about it."
Stilts, ribbon windows, openings in the walls, open roof terrace. What made it possible for Le Corbusier to design a house with such freedom was a material little used at that time, reinforced concrete. Since 1914, Le Corbusier had envisioned using a structure made from reinforced concrete to allow him total freedom in constructing what he wanted, how he wanted. As it was made up of simple posts with superimposed floors, supporting walls which obstructed the space could be done away with. Le Corbusier thus set down the principles of modern architecture.
Essentially, a construction is erected on the ground. Basically, you have posts and then some slabs, possibly supported by beams, but they are adjoining elements placed one on top of another. This is fundamentally different to previous constructions. They also have foundations, of course, but you had to build walls which supported the flooring. But we can see that essentially these walls obscure, whereas Le Corbusier's walls offer transparency. It makes a huge difference. In Le Corbusier's buildings, you can enclose the space wherever you want to. You can add a partition wall or a facade here and have a balcony there. Whereas here, in the previous case, the structure itself encloses the space, and so you have no freedom. Everything that he did and everything they did at the time was a liberation in architecture.
In the mid-1920s, a new type of freeform architecture was born. It was known as functionalism, meaning that it adapted to its inhabitants' way of life. The Villa Savoy was the emblem of this. With its system of stilts, the house floats over the ground and allows, for example, the garden to continue underneath the villa, creating a space where children can play ball. Inside, Le Corbusier could freely organise the space, according to however the owner wanted to use the house. As there were no supporting walls, thanks to the concrete pillars, the living room could run alongside an open-air terrace. The architect could make the windows whatever size and shape he wanted. He could also highlight the ever-present landscape. For Le Corbusier, architecture was something you lived, and even, as he said, something you walked.
The theme of architectural promenades that he explored was linked to his experiences of the countryside.
Se déplacer dans une maison, comme on se déplace.
Travelling within a house as you travel along a mountain path, viewing the peaks, looking down towards the valleys, this three-dimensional, spatial and kinetic experience.
In his quest for perfection, Le Corbusier also imagined the furniture of his purist villas. Together with Charlotte Perriand, he would create furniture that he named with his initials. LC for Le Corbusier, followed by a number. This is the famous chaise longue, the LC4, that became a design icon. Or the LC2 armchair that everyone now calls Le Corbusier armchair. Designed almost half a century ago, this furniture embodies modernity like little else. Timeless, they have since been copied many times. With this architectural totality, Le Corbusier secured a place for himself in the history of art.
In the course of the 1920s, Le Corbusier goes from being an unknown to being one of the best-known architects in the world.
While Le Corbusier was a revered architect the world over, there was still one person who resisted him, whom he was not yet close to impressing: Marie Generale, his mother. Since the death of her husband, she lived alone on the edge of Lake Geneva. Her son built her a house more suited to her new life. It was more modest than the white villa that he had constructed years before, and that had ruined his parents. Le Corbusier applied all his architectural know-how to it. With its small surface of 64 square meters, he rationalized the space. It was a real machine for living, very functional and agreeable, with ribbon windows that magnified the beauty of the view of Lake Geneva. But Marie Generale, dissatisfied, focused on the small problems she encountered in this house.
She is very upset because the roof leaks. She writes to him and complains. It becomes the dominating issue. He blames the engineer. He writes new plans for the engineer. The roof continues to leak. He writes to his mother and says, "If you bothered to pay attention to the world around you, you would know that I have become one of the most famous architects in the world. I have clients here and there and so on." And she basically writes back and says, "Very good, my roof is still leaking." It's also really symbolic of their relationship. He never can really get things right for her.
Le Corbusier did not see himself as a simple builder of houses. His ambition went far beyond that. He wanted to construct entire towns, to change lives through architecture. From this point on, he pursued his obsessive goal to build the radiant city, his ideal city, the start of which had been the Plein Voisin in Paris. If the France of the Third Republic wasn't interested, he would try abroad. With bolder emerging powers, Le Corbusier roamed the planet to try to convince others. First in America, where in New York the buildings did not impress him. Having just arrived, he stated brashly to the press, "The skyscrapers are not big enough." Welcoming him like a star, the most prestigious universities fought over him for conferences on the city of the future, which incited eager curiosity.
After the lecture, the women are so in love with him and with his power that they flock to the drawings that he's made on big rolls of paper on the wall, and they tear little pieces of the paper to keep with them as mementos, like talisman, forever after, of the experience of seeing this passionate, gigantic man speaking to them about building.
During his travels, Le Corbusier would seduce one of the greatest celebrities of that time, Josephine Baker. They met in 1929 on a transatlantic crossing.
She would pose for him in the nude in his stateroom on the boat. He would do drawings of her. Josephine Baker said of Le Corbusier, "Ce monsieur Le Corbusier, il est gai et il est simple." She recognized in him a man of enormous heart.
From then on, Le Corbusier was a member of the elite, frequenting the world's greats. His clients were very rich. Yet he did not divert from his course. He turned to developing countries, particularly Latin America, where he hoped to construct a new town. He was convinced that was where there was the greatest need, where he would be able to accomplish his true mission, guided by a form of humanism. In Rio de Janeiro, Le Corbusier spent a long time filming the people of the favelas with his personal camera. He had a real empathy for the poor and disadvantaged. He wanted to build for them more than for his rich art enthusiast clients.
My duty, my goal, is to try and take people out of unhappiness, out of catastrophe, to bring them into happiness. Daily joy, harmony. The home should be the backdrop to life, the machine for happiness.
Dans la posture de Le Corbusier,
In terms of Le Corbusier's position towards the world and his contemporaries, there was a strong messianic component. He identified greatly with the prophets of different religions, and this prophetic, messianic dimension was strong. He was a bearer of a message that could save humanity.
To fulfill his almost divine mission, the architect's projects became more and more crazy. This is what he devised for Algiers in 1931. A building 10 kilometers long that ran along the coastline and the roof of which was a motorway. He named it Project Obus because it had to annihilate every received idea. But these projects did not get past the drawing board. Only the Second World War offered him new hope.
The modern architects of Le Corbusier's generation were impatient for war to break out in the 1930s. They were preparing for it. His generation thought that the destruction of cities was a positive thing, and so he, along with many others, actually welcomed the bombs falling on the cities. They thought that the work that democracy would not allow them to do, the destruction of these cities, would be carried out by the bombers.
In 1945, the bombers had done their work. It was time for reconstruction to begin. Le Corbusier was not to realize his dream of reconstructing an entire town, but in 1946, the Ministry of Public Reconstruction did engage him to work on an ambitious social housing program.
And in France, we're in the final stages of construction of a housing block on stilts that will give part of Marseille an unusual look of integral modernism. It is the first time that the great architect Le Corbusier realizes his dream of rational housing in France. Le Corbusier in Marseille. This may be the foundation stone for the city of the future.
Le Corbusier was in his 60s when he was finally able to build his radiant city. He wanted to make it the distillation of the principles that had guided his vision of a utopian city for the last 20 years. His goal was to give happiness through his architecture to the thousands of inhabitants of this social housing. Using reinforced concrete, he could build on stilts so that everyone would benefit from an open view and from the light. His big idea was to bring the town into the building. And indeed, the inhabitants of the radiant city benefited from everything on site that you could find in a city centre. Shops, a post office, a school, a restaurant, offices, and even, to welcome passing friends, a hotel. On the huge roof terrace, he constructed a vast leisure area. But what was of prime importance for the architect was the quality of the housing. He wanted to offer the inhabitants what at that time in the immediate post-war period was still reserved for the rich, a comfortable way of living. For Le Corbusier, luxury was achieved by fitting the apartments out in a modern style, but above all through the organisation of space and light. The apartments were cleverly organised as duplexes. Each room had large windows letting in lots of light and breathtaking views.
He realizes the most magnificent creation, a building where people in a low financial bracket, this is important to remember, have a chance to look in one direction at the sea and in another direction at the mountains from every apartment, because they're duplex apartments where above they look one way, below they look the other way, and they interlock. The design inside is genius, with places for milk to be left, with comfortable kitchens, and so on. The nursery on the roof is pure joy.
Le Corbusier had made a major statement. At the start of the 1950s, people rushed to discover his utopian building. Even the great Pablo Picasso came to admire his masterpiece. With the inauguration of the Radiant City, Le Corbusier, who had already taken on French nationality, became a significant figure in France's heritage.
The immobile ocean liner contains 347 apartments, many of which are already occupied. They are all equipped with the most modern comforts. On the terrace, its creator, the architect Le Corbusier, receives the Legion of Honor decoration of Commander from Mr. Claudius Petit. The Radiant City is born.
Le Corbusier was satisfied. He wrote to his mother the following day.
Big day yesterday. It was very beautiful. The reason? The house is one of the great works of architecture of any era, and people are living inside as in a mirage. The kids have already understood this future life, devoted to happiness, warmth, and heart.
His mother died in 1960 at the age of 99. A few years earlier, he had paid true homage to her by constructing this chapel at Ronchamp. One of his greatest works, one of his most personal. A remarkable building, groundbreaking in its visual shapes. This concrete construction was like a poem to his mother. He inscribed her name on many of the windows. Marie.
Ronchamp is a church in honor of the Virgin, Marie. I cannot help but seeing it as a reference to his mother, the obsession of his life,
C'est une sorte d'anthologie.
It was a sort of anthology of Le Corbusier's career, just as the White Villa had been during the first part of his life. Many of Le Corbusier's projects were like that. They were autobiographical documents.
In 1952, the great architect was at the peak of his career, yet he was leaning more and more towards a frugal lifestyle, even asceticism. He went to the shores of the Mediterranean, near to Roquebrune, to construct a simple cabin where he would spend all his free time. A small closed world of 16 square meters with just the bare essentials. Spartan in its comforts. Only his observation of the surrounding nature seemed to matter.
J'ai pu observer qu'il y avait une espèce de fascination.
I've noticed that great creators have a fascination for the universe of the cabin, this little closed world. It may have something to do with the Diogenes barrel or Plato's cave. In any case, this idea that you can associate genius with the idea of the cabin.
Robert, a young neighbour, a child at the time, well remembers the very simple old man who spent all his summers at his cabin.
Je suis sur les genoux de Corbusier, à côté de Corbusier.
That's me on Le Corbusier's lap, next to Le Corbusier, Yvonne, his wife, and in the background you can see my father in a vest. So that's a little bit of the family scene where Le Corbusier looks very relaxed. He's in a place of friendship, peace and tranquility.
Pour lui, d'amitié, de paix, de tranquillité.
Le Corbusier, who had always observed nature to inspire his architecture, filmed it a lot with his small camera. The elderly architect's lessons on nature and the little secrets he revealed about the nature of his creations made a deep impression on Robert.
Je lui apporte un pétale de la fleur.
I brought him a petal from the flower of the banana tree, which was on the ground. A large ochre red, brick red petal. Le Corbusier took out his penknife and opened it up. The petal was curved like this, and he said to me, "This is the shape of the roof of Ronchamp." All his discussions were along these sorts of lines.
On the 27th of August 1965, the elderly man went bathing outside his cabin just as he did every day. He would never return. Charles-Édouard Generale, known as Le Corbusier, died at the age of 77.